right. I believe we have started the webinar and we're going to get going. Welcome. Happy morning, good afternoon, happy evening, wherever you are in the world. We very much appreciate you all joining us for this presentation and this discussion about key findings from the administrations of the UC Berkeley Psychedelic Survey and the RAND Psychedelic Survey. I'm Andrea Venezia. I'm Executive Director of the UC Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics, or BCSP. Before we start, I want to go over some important information about this webinar. So there's information here about how to download the report on the Open Science Framework, or OSF, and our team's going to chat that link. We're recording this webinar and we'll post it later. It'll be posted this week on the same page, the psychedelics.berkeley.edu/survey, and on our YouTube channel as well. And our team's going to chat the link to YouTube. We want to make sure we answer questions, so please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we'll have time to answer questions at the end of the webinar. So let me share about who's going to be speaking during this webinar. So here's the panel, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by my colleagues Karanda Morgan, the BCSP Strategy Director, Tyrone Scambati, a postdoctoral research scientist at the BCSP, and Michelle Priest, a psychedelics policy researcher at RAND and one of the leads for the RAND Psychedelic Survey. I also want to thank our communications team for doing all the back-end work for this webinar. So next slide, please. So with regard to the BCSP, our mission is to advance psychedelic discovery for the public good, and that is our hope for today's webinar. And we have a few objectives that we want to share with you. So we want to share our findings from the Berkeley Psychedelic Survey. Our report came out 2 weeks ago, and our team will chat a link to that report. So Tyrone, Karanda, and I will share findings from that. Our second objective is to collaborate with RAND, and Michelle is going to share findings to date, given that both organizations are doing survey research on psychedelics, and we're chatting a link to RAND's report next. Our third objective is to highlight the partnership that we have between the BCSP and RAND and our unique roles in this space. While we're researching similar topics, Michelle's presentation will highlight the differences between our two surveys and how we think about comparing and contrasting them. Finally, and again, we want to make sure we answer questions from you all. We'll do that at the end. As a bridge into beginning to share about our findings, at a high level with regard to the UC Berkeley Psychedelic Survey, our findings revealed 4 main themes. 1, exposure to psychedelics is reaching new heights. 2, there's a lack of trust in professional sources of information about psychedelics. 3, support for psychedelics research and regulated access to psychedelics are increasing. And 4, concern and stigma about psychedelics are still widespread. So with that as some framing, I'll turn to Tyrone to share about the BCSP's approach to our survey administration, and he'll share the first set of findings.
Sorry, I'm muted. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the methodologies underlying the UC Berkeley Psychedelic Survey and the results that we'll be sharing today. So what's new with the UC Berkeley Psychedelic Survey? As many of you know, 2 years ago, we fielded the inaugural assessment of the UC Berkeley Psychedelic Survey in 2023. What's changed in the last 2 years? So the new team leading the survey has made several steps to improve the methodological and analytical rigor of the survey. For one, we enhanced the clarity of existing survey questions to improve reliability and validity. By removing ambiguity in questions, we move towards ensuring that participants have the same understanding of a question when answering, which ultimately leads to more accurate results. We also added new questions that are timely, topically relevant, and dive deeper into 2023's findings. Now, this one's a bit more technical, but we added significance testing into all of our comparative analyses in 2025 and explicitly quantified uncertainty in our estimates. This helps us determine how likely a difference we're seeing is due to chance versus a real phenomenon in the world. This includes our new change over time analyses. Now that we have 2 administrations, 2023 and 2025, we can track how voters' beliefs are changing over time. And you'll get some kind of a sneak peek of that in our results sections later. Finally, we're working toward a more robust open science framework. The appendix of our report, linked in the chat, has technical details about these methodological changes, along with a link to our open science repository, which Andrea mentioned earlier. This repository is publicly available. It contains the code we use to analyze the data, easy to find uncertainty estimates, and the survey instrument itself. So who are our respondents? The BCSP worked with FM3 Research, an opinion research and strategy firm, to collect a probability sample of roughly 1,600 US voters in mid-2025. We'd like to thank FM3 for their partnership in both administrations of the UC Berkeley Psychedelic Survey. So using information from voter rolls, voters from all 50 states in the District of Columbia were contacted at random via telephone or text and asked if they would like to answer questions about their attitudes on topics related to psychedelics. They completed the survey online or over the phone, dual mode survey, and we also accounted for over and underrepresentation of certain groups in our sample relative to the target population of registered US voters by using observation weights that FM3 research provided to us. These weights account for gender, age, census region, past election participation, political ideology, and education. Altogether, this full sample yields a margin of error of approximately 2.5 percentage points. And before diving into the results, I want to address an attendee question that was submitted prior to the webinar. How were psychedelics defined in our survey? We took an expansive view of psychedelics in our survey, providing participants a list of substances that are often considered psychedelics at the beginning of the survey, and then asking about psychedelics generally in each question. You can see the exact text that participants saw on the slide. Okay, moving into results, I'm going to talk about exposure to psychedelics and trust in sources of information about psychedelics. So, proximity to psychedelic use is one of the things that the UC Berkeley Psychedelics Survey is tracking over time. And in 2025, 57% of voters indicated that they or someone close to them had ever used psychedelics. This represents a 4% increase from our first wave of data in 2023, which is statistically significant. But of particular note were the outsized significant increases among several demographic groups who had particularly low levels of proximity to psychedelic use in 2023. So following along in that table, if you look at the uppermost white row, Black voters had the biggest increases, with proximity to psychedelic use exceeding 40% in 2025, up 15% from 2023. In 2025, 48% of voters who were 65 years of age or older indicated proximity to psychedelic use, up 12%. And finally, 51% of conservatives, now a majority, said that they had said that they had proximity to psychedelic use in 2025. Despite these large increases, all three of these groups remain below the average of all US voters in 2025. So this looks more like a catch-up phenomenon, moving these groups who are historically lower than average closer to the average of all US voters. And we plan to keep on tracking these groups in the 2026 administration of the UC Berkeley Psychedelic Survey. Another question that we asked is how often voters had heard about psychedelics over the past year. The most common response was a few times each year at 41%, which you can see on the slide. However, 33% of voters said that they heard about psychedelics monthly or more in the last year. The last thing I want to draw your attention to is the 1/5 of voters who reported not having heard anything about psychedelics over the past year. That's that never bar. Throughout our results, we find consistent evidence that a meaningful segment of the population has very little knowledge and/or exposure to psychedelics. And although this isn't necessarily a surprise, it points to significant room for growth in terms of public education and science communication about psychedelics, which is increasingly important as access to psychedelics expands. Digging deeper into information that US voters are getting about psychedelics, we presented voters with a list of sources that they might have heard about psychedelics from. Important to note that respondents could select multiple responses in response to this question. As you can see, news was the most common source of information. This was followed by a range of sources, including various forms of media and personal connection. And only 10% of voters reported having heard about psychedelics from a medical professional, which is the bottom bar on the screen right now. Only a few less common sources rounded out the bottom of our list. Although the quality of the information provided by any of these sources is not a foregone conclusion, the prevalence of information from sources like entertainment media, social media, and personal connections raises concerns about the evidence-based accuracy of information that voters are receiving about psychedelics. Especially now, with growing excitement about psychedelics, potentially outpacing research on their efficacy and safety, this is a particularly important dimension that we aim to track moving forward. So, in thinking about what delivery of evidence-based information to the broader public could look like, we probed what sources of information about psychedelics currently have voters' trust. As you can see, mental health professionals had the highest levels of very trustworthy ratings. It's the furthest left segment of the bar on the screen, um, followed by medical professionals. Notably, however, trust was still relatively low, with only between a fourth and a third rating these groups as very trustworthy. As you can see, other groups, other sources of information fared much worse, with substantially lower very trustworthy ratings. One thing that stood out to us here was the high proportion of voters who rated these sources as somewhat trustworthy. In fact, for all of our sources except faith leaders, this was the most common response. And to us, this points to the possibility that voters are open to trust building with these sources of information. An open question for us is the extent to which these patterns reflect broader kind of domain general levels of trust towards these sources of information, or whether voters have unique considerations about who they trust for information about psychedelics. And this is something we're hoping to continue to explore moving forward. Finally, among the demographic groups we looked at, perceptions of trustworthiness varied most consistently by political orientation. On the y-axis of the figure, you'll have the estimated proportion of voters that rated each source on the x-axis as very trustworthy. The sources on the x-axis are the same sources that were on the previous slide. As you can see, there are substantial differences between conservatives and liberals in the source or in the trust they have towards different sources of information. All the differences here are statistically significant, except for faith leaders and people with experience with psychedelics. As discussed in the report, some of these differences, particularly those in trust towards medicine and higher education, mirror more general differences in trust reported by Democrats and Republicans in separate research not conducted by the BCSP. We read this as an example of the fact that a one-size-fits-all public education or science communication effort is likely to encounter obstacles. Instead, these efforts should be attuned to the levels of trust and skepticism that their target audiences have and try to build rapport where necessary. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Karanda, who's going to talk about the concerns voters have about psychedelics and how they perceive people who use them. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Tyrone. And hi, everyone. My name is Karanda, and I'll be talking through this next phase of our data, where we look more closely at the safety and social perceptions of psychedelics. So when we asked voters how well certain safety descriptors applied to psychedelics, whether they are safe to use in a supervised setting, safer than tobacco, and safer than alcohol, the results exposed a sense of caution. First, I want to quickly explain the progression of the key at the bottom of this chart. For our analysis, we combined the responses of pretty well and extremely well as a strong signal of public agreement. And as you can see, looking at the figures on the right side of this graph, those strong signals for safety are actually quite low. And so let's dig into that a little bit. Only 37% of voters feel that the phrase safe to use in a supervised setting describes psychedelics pretty or extremely well. And contrast this public hesitation with the fact that federal agencies like the Food and Drug Administration deem these substances safe enough to administer in a supervised setting in ongoing clinical trials, yet nearly 2/3 of the public remain unconvinced. The contrast becomes even sharper when we compare psychedelics to everyday legal substances, tobacco and alcohol. Only 20% of voters believe psychedelics are safer than tobacco, and just 18% believe they are safer than alcohol. And this is a fascinating snapshot of public perception of safety because it highlights this assumption that people tend to assume that what is legal must be safer. Alcohol and tobacco are legal and regulated, whereas psychedelics are not, at least not ubiquitously so. Yet the ongoing research and general scientific consensus, supported by researchers such as David Nutt, actually suggests that psychedelics are less harmful and carry lower addiction profiles than these legal substances. And my colleague's going to share a paper from David Nutt and colleagues that dives into this more in the chat. I want to reiterate here that our position is not that psychedelics are completely safe. There are risks to everything. But rather, this data helps us understand the level of trepidation that the public has, especially compared to substances that are available and to a certain extent accepted in their daily lives. And when you pair this trepidation with the large dark gray percentages of people that answered don't know, it points to this lack of understanding, this gap between scientific evidence and public opinion, as well as the need for public education to help inform Americans about the conditions for psychedelic use that minimize risk. Building on that overarching trepidation that we just discussed, let's look at some of the specific negative outcomes the public is most worried about. What exactly are the negative outcomes that people fear? And using that same key where we isolated pretty well and extremely well responses, our data shows that concerns around mental health and addiction are top of mind. As you can see on the graph, 38% of voters believe the phrase can cause new mental health challenges describes psychedelics well, and 35% firmly believe that they are addictive. Additionally, over a quarter of the public, 26%, associates these substances with being a cause of crime. It's important that we look beneath these national figures because these concerns are felt more acutely by specific demographic and political groups. For example, exactly half of the Black voters we surveyed believe psychedelics are addictive and can cause new mental health challenges, rates that are significantly higher than non-Black voters. And politically, significantly more conservatives than liberals are likely to view psychedelics as addictive, causes of crime, and threats to mental health. This data is showing us that the public holds real caution in regards to psychedelics. Both the evidence base on negative outcomes, such as adverse health effects, and public education campaigns have room to grow, especially in ways that are directly tailored to different political and sociodemographic groups. This brings us to social perceptions surrounding psychedelics. And building on those safety concerns, we wanted to measure stigma by asking, how does the public view people who use a psychedelic substance? And when we look at the results, the most frequently selected descriptors are generally favorable ones. As you can see at the top of the chart, nearly half of American voters, 48%, describe people who use psychedelics as open-minded, and 37% characterize them as creative. Yet as we look further down the list, stigmatizing labels remain present for a notable segment of our sample population. Roughly a quarter of the voting public directly applies labels like addicts and irresponsible to people who use these substances. At the same time, very few respondents selected traits like smart or moral. And once again, I want to draw your attention to the gray don't know responses on the right side of this figure, where up to 29% of voters selected don't know when asked to apply these social labels. This reinforces a pattern that we saw with the safety and risk data. A substantial portion of voting American public does not necessarily have a fixed view. The public narrative around who uses psychedelics is still forming, which underscores that ongoing need for a deeper examination of the root causes of these stigmas and potential programming and policies that address these. Oops. We break down these social perceptions of how voters describe users of psychedelics further by looking at political orientation. As you can see in this table, the application of these descriptors varies significantly across political lines. For example, 59% of liberals view people who use psychedelics as open-minded, whereas only 38% of conservatives apply that same label. And conversely, when looking at stigmatizing labels, conservatives are approximately twice as likely as liberals to view individuals who use psychedelics as addicts, at 36% compared to 17%, or as irresponsible. And what this data demonstrates is that public perceptions of psychedelic use are not uniform. They are heavily mediated by political and cultural lenses. And this reinforces that point we discussed earlier, that efforts towards public education or policy awareness should consider those varying baseline beliefs held by different groups. Finally, to conclude this section on social perception, beyond our multiple choice data, we wanted to capture the public's exact questions about psychedelics in their own words. We asked an open-ended question: what questions do you have about psychedelics? And I'm sure many of you in the audience have your own. We received over 700 verbatim responses and conducted qualitative thematic coding to examine the specific areas of both curiosity and uncertainty, which are here on the slide in purple. The results help bring color to some of those gray don't know responses that we've been tracking and illuminate more details into what people are still hungry to learn about psychedelics, their conditions for use, their effect on our brain, body, and mind, who to trust, and how to access. So first, we see questions centered around therapeutic promise. Respondents are asking highly practical questions about efficacy and personal well-being, such as, could they help me be happier? And what benefits can they have for people with mental illness? What research backs this? Second, we identified a theme centered around trustworthiness. People are looking for authoritative, credible perspectives to help them navigate this space, asking questions like, what do medical experts think about it? Third, we see questions regarding physical effects. Voters had foundational questions about how these substances impact the body and brain, asking things like, do psychedelics kill brain cells? And do these substances damage the body if used frequently? Fourth, we categorized a set of questions under the theme of stigma. Reflecting some of the societal concerns we measured on previous slides, respondents are directly asking questions like, why are people afraid of their use? Fifth, we looked at conditions of use. People want to understand the practical parameters for safety and administration, asking what does a safe dose look like, and would a person taking them therapeutically need active supervision? Sixth, we see pharmacological concern questions. People have foundational queries about how these substances function on a chemical level, asking, do they have addictive qualities? And what's the difference between the different psychedelics? And how do they react differently in the body? And finally, questions regarding governance, access, and safety. Respondents asked about systemic oversight and legalization, such as, if psychedelics are legalized, how will they be monitored? And can some of these be made legal for health reasons? And what this qualitative analysis demonstrates is that public caution is accompanied by a very genuine demand for credible evidence and understanding across multiple domains. These 7 themes provide a potential roadmap for where public education and awareness efforts can be directed to address the knowledge gaps that do exist and feed the curiosity of a voting public who wants to learn more. And that concludes the data on social perceptions of psychedelics. I'll now hand it over to Andrea, who will walk us through the next section of our data focused on policy perceptions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Karanda. So like Karanda said, I'll be talking about some policy-related issues before handing it over to Michelle to talk about Ram's work. Just as an aside, I saw a question in the Q&A. Really appreciate it. Bring the questions forward to us anytime. We're tracking them, and we'll address as many as we can at the end. So we are very curious about what people think about how psychedelics are used in society and culture, and particularly about how they're used toward public good aims, meaning how could our medical, research, legal, policy systems, and similar might use psychedelics to benefit the public good. So we therefore measured support for a number of policy reforms so that we could understand how useful voters perceive psychedelics to be for different purposes. A general takeaway is that we found that regulated use with clear guardrails related to safety is gaining traction, while support for unregulated access is not. Over time, we hope that this survey can be a barometer of public opinion about both trend data, the same issues over time, and specific issues that are of the moment, as mentioned earlier, given how rapidly things are changing with regard to publicly available information about and access to psychedelics. As we continue to administer this survey, it will track how support for psychedelics-related policies is changing, who voters think should have access to psychedelics, and which medical or mental health conditions, if any, voters think psychedelics can help. So, taking a look at what we found with regard to policy-related topics, looking at this table, the support for psychedelic policy proposals, this is a question that we asked in both 2023 and in 2025, so we can start to look at change over time. So we listed 4 policy proposed shifts. Those are making psychedelics easier for scientists to study, making psychedelics a prescription medicine, making therapeutic use of psychedelics legal, and removing criminal penalties for personal use possession of psychedelics. So we have the proportion of voters who strongly support each one. We also listed the changes over time, with the top 3 being statistically significant increases. So here is a clear example of guardrails of use within systems and society, seeing pretty large increases in just 2 years. We see an increase of 14% between 2023 and 2025 in making psychedelics easier for scientists to study, with a majority of voters, 63% supporting that in 2025. We see a 12% increase between 2023 and 2025 for making psychedelics a prescription medicine, and a 10% increase in that time for making therapeutic use of psychedelics legal. Despite an increase in local legislation that decriminalizes personal possession, we observe somewhat tepid support from voters for this kind of policy, 28%. That's representing a small, not statistically significant decrease compared to 2023. In partnership with Psychedelic Alpha, CalX, and Antithesis Law, we keep an updated law and policy map that provides information about psychedelic policy initiatives nationally. Our team's going to chat that link to the map, so that if you're curious to dig around, you can. So the wave of support for scientific psychedelic research and for other highly regulated options could possibly indicate that many voters are curious about psychedelic substances and their effects, or have heard promising information about their applicability in certain contexts, but have concerns about their safety and efficacy. One interpretation is that people could be worried about the risks, or mindful of psychedelics' current and historical legal parameters and stigmas, resulting in them being more supportive of psychedelics in a controlled environment. Another might be that some think the societal benefits might outweigh personal use in non-clinical settings. These are issues that we hope to explore qualitatively by talking with people in structured research projects in the future. This survey brought up a lot of whats. We have a lot of questions about the whys in the House. Next slide, please. So this past year, given our assumption that there would be an increase in awareness and potentially in proximity to psychedelics, we were curious about whether people are open to youth being educated about psychedelics. This is an example of us asking a question that is of the moment, that's gauged to ask something that taps into the cultural zeitgeist. So we asked if respondents would support a program to educate high school students with factual scientific information about benefits and risks of psychedelics. Over 1/3 of voters indicated strong support, the top bar. An additional 30% of voters indicated that they're somewhat supportive of this kind of program, the second bar from the top. Therefore, a substantial majority, 65%, indicated they might be open to some kind of public education regarding psychedelics, combining the strongly and the somewhat support. Given the lack of consensus nationally about education issues in general right now, we were surprised by this level of support, although we caution there's a clear need to have a deeper understanding of people's views about teaching risks, benefits, or both. Right. Since this question focuses on high school students, we examined whether parents of children under 18 years old reported any unique patterns of support. We found no significant difference in strong support between voters who are parents of children under 18, 32%, versus those who are not, 36%. Overall, while our data shows some support for scientifically based education initiatives in high schools on the risks and benefits associated with psychedelics, when we connect this finding to the lack of trust presented earlier, that could make public education efforts challenging. So let's move on to what we learned about people's perceptions of psychedelics' usefulness for different purposes. The next slide, please. As this graphic illustrates, substantial proportions of voters, as high as 33%, do not know if psychedelics are useful for the different use case scenarios we provided. That's the far right side of the graphic, or the dark gray part if you see color. This is consistent with two of the findings detailed earlier in our report, that approximately 20% of voters have not heard about psychedelics in the past year, and many voters are skeptical of information sources about psychedelics. To look at the purposes people thought were most useful, the key reads from left to right: not at all useful, slightly useful, somewhat useful, pretty useful, and extremely useful. On the far right, in blue font, for those who see colors, we combined pretty useful and extremely useful like the other graphics, because those indicate a strong signal of perceived utility. Looking at that signal, psychedelics were viewed as most useful for end-of-life distress, PTSD, and treatment-resistant forms of mental health disorders such as depression and anxiety. Between 37% and 45% of voters reported that psychedelics are pretty or extremely useful for those uses. Please note, and we detail this more in the report, that anxiety, depression, PTSD, and their treatment-resistant counterparts, denoted by TR, were split sampled, meaning that groups of respondents received different questions. So the appendix of the report goes into that in more detail. Next slide, please. So we also sought to learn about voters' views about access levels, illegal, regulated, or removal of penalties they think are most appropriate for different populations. We found what we're calling a hierarchy of support for different access levels emerging based on the psychedelic users' specific circumstances. These findings demonstrate a spectrum of permissiveness toward the use of psychedelics. So there's a lot to digest in this graphic. Note that the vertical access goes to 60% and not to 100. One clear takeaway is that voters are more supportive of regulated access, the second cluster from the left, than of decriminalized, the third cluster from the left, or illegal access, the first cluster on the left. And there's a fair amount of support, over 50%, for treating addiction, depression, and veterans, with close to 50% support for end-of-life care use. As the framing of our report indicates, there's caution, concern, and stigma, we think, at play in people's responses, and we suspect there are likely signs of those in the responses to decriminalized and illegal usages. For that category, end-of-life care has the most support, 38%, with regard to decriminalization scenarios. It's important to note that respondents could choose only one most appropriate level of access for each group, and 38% selected our most permissive access level, removal of criminal penalties for possession and use, for people receiving end-of-life care, which left a smaller share of voters to select other more restrictive options. Complementing the policy reform data presented earlier, this suggests that for US voters, there's not a single monolithic option on access to psychedelics, but rather one that is dependent on the needs and conditions of different populations. So to conclude the BCSP's portion of this presentation, our main areas of exploration: exposure to psychedelics, trust, policy changes, and stigmas and concerns, yielded findings that are relevant for the quickly evolving psychedelics policy landscape. As exposure to psychedelics, interest, and support have increased with many demographic groups since 2023, voters report a lack of very trustworthy sources of information, while stigmas and concerns loom large. The complex mix of perceptions and attitudes shown in these data, paired with systematic demographic variations, suggests that effective messaging strategies and public education will need to build trust with specific audiences and fill knowledge gaps. Importantly, this research provides information about what people think, but not why they think the way they do, or why there are differences in perspectives between groups. Qualitative research would have illuminated much needed information about why, for example, certain populations saw such increases in proximity to psychedelics over time. There's likely not one communication strategy, program, or messenger that could address the complexities in ways that would effectively inform all demographic groups. These data indicate that advances made in this field might be fragile with regard to public perception, and that public education likely requires a multi-pronged, multi-organizational approach to providing accurate, effective, accessible, and scientifically based information. I'll now turn it over to Michelle from RAND to share findings from the research that she and her team have been doing.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Priest, and I'll go back to my previous slide. I co-lead the RAND psychedelic survey with my colleague, Bo Kilmer. And RAND is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization that focuses on public policy research. I'll be sharing our findings related to public opinion on psychedelics policy from the RAND Psychedelics Survey. And then I'll compare and contrast our findings to the BCSP's findings where there's some overlap with what they just presented. So here's some background on the RAND Psychedelics Survey, which we refer to as the RPS. We fielded this most recent wave of the RPS in September 2025. We're using NORC at the University of Chicago's AmeriSpeak panel, and our respondents were adults that are US residents ages 18 and older. And we had about 10,000 respondents for this survey. The sampling for this survey is probability-based and address-based sampling using NORC's national sample frame, and that covers approximately 97% of households in the US. In this survey, we also oversampled veterans and had about 1,500 veteran respondents in the sample. And we offered questions on the survey in English and Spanish, and about 97% of the surveys were completed online, and the rest were completed over the phone. So I'd like to say a few other things actually about the RPS. We also ran a previous wave of the RPS in 2023, like BCSP did with their survey. We did not ask any questions about public opinion in that survey. So all of the results that I show today will be from the 2025 RPS. And we have more waves coming this year from this survey using the same panel from NORC. So a longitudinal wave that follows respondents who have used psychedelics over time, and then another cross-sectional wave similar to this one that will run in fall of this year. So in the 2025 RPS, we asked about a variety of topics. So first we asked about prevalence of use for 11 psychedelic substances. And then we asked the public opinion questions about psychedelics policy that I'll be presenting on today. We also asked additional questions for those who said that they had used psilocybin, LSD, and MDMA. And that was a variety of questions about frequency of use, microdosing, spending, sources, reasons for use, all kinds of things. And then we also had a special section of questions specific to veterans. And that was the reason for the oversample of veterans in this survey. And we have a couple publications that have already come out from the 2025 RPS data. And the first one was really about prevalence of use and microdosing. The next one is about public opinion on legalizing psychedelics, and that's what I'll be presenting on today. We have more publications in progress, one on the questions that we asked veterans and their use of psychedelics, comparing them to non-veterans in the US. That's coming out in the next few months over the summer. And then many other publications related to the other topics that I mentioned that we asked about in the 2025 RPS. And you can find all of our research that we've published so far, both from the 2025 wave of the RPS and the earlier data from 2023 at rand.org/psychedelics. So this table just shows a quick comparison of recent nationally representative surveys on psychedelics policy preferences. And the two surveys at the bottom are a BCSP survey that they just presented on, and our survey that I just gave a little bit of background on. The two at the top are other kind of nationally representative surveys. And as you can see, the sample sizes for the first three surveys on here are similar to BCSP's survey. Our sample size is quite a bit larger, and the main reason for that is that we were looking to recruit respondents who had used psychedelic substances for later sections of the survey, in addition to our longitudinal survey. And of course, that subset from the nationally representative group is going to be much smaller, and we wanted to make sure that we had a large enough sample size for that. I would also like to point out just the comparison of the sampling strategies on the right side of the screen. You can see that they're very similar. These are all nationally representative. They're weighted in different ways, but Berkeley's survey focused on US voters and our survey focused on US adult residents that were 18 and older. And I'll talk a little bit more after I present our findings about some of the ways that our survey questionnaires differed between Berkeley survey and the RAND survey. But one of our major contributions was to ask about policy preferences for specific psychedelic substances rather than a general category of psychedelics. And you'll see how that plays out in the data. So I'd like to start just with a benchmark for our findings with some data from Gallup. So this is not data that RAND collected. These are results from a question that Gallup has asked since 1969 with some gaps in there. You can see the years on the x-axis, and the question is, should the use of marijuana be legal or not? Now, we don't consider marijuana, and I'm using the term marijuana here just to be consistent with their question wording. We would actually prefer the term cannabis, but well, I'll use marijuana in here because that's how they how Gallup has phrased this question. We don't consider marijuana to be a psychedelic substance, but we're using this as a benchmark since we have kind of a longer time scale of data that we can compare to public opinion for psychedelic substances. So as you can see, there's a trend in this data, and the question is, should the use of marijuana be legal or not? So we asked that same question for marijuana and then some psychedelic substances, which I'll show on the next slide. And we were very glad to see that our result for should the use of marijuana be legal or not was almost exactly the same as what Gallup found in their survey in 2025. So that gives us good confidence that our findings are somewhat on par with another similar kind of nationally representative data source. So here you can see these are responses to questions that are framed similar to that Gallup question. So this is, should the use of psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, MDMA, and separate questions be legal or not? And we also include cocaine in this question, in this set of questions. We don't consider cocaine a psychedelic substance either. This is just for some comparison. So you can see that, support for the legal use of marijuana is between 60 and 70%. I think it's around 64% in 2025, much higher than any of the psychedelic substances. But support for psilocybin, the legal use of psilocybin mushrooms, was around 23%. And then LSD and MDMA in this formulation of the question were right around support for legal use of those substances was right around what we saw for cocaine. And I'd like to point out, going back to this kind of data trend for that we see from Gallup for marijuana, you see that when support for the legal use of marijuana was kind of between 20% and 30%, which is what we see for psilocybin mushrooms right now, corresponds to this period in the 80s and early 90s that was kind of before a lot of policy changes started happening for marijuana. So this raises an interesting question about where the future of psychedelics policy might be going and whether we're at kind of a similar inflection point right now, which I think maybe some of BCSP's findings indicate that that's possible. And of course, psychedelic substances have many differences from cannabis. And so we could see these policies develop in very different ways than we've seen cannabis policy develop in the United States in the period since public opinion was around this same level. So after we asked the question about legal use of these substances, we then asked more detailed questions. And again, we broke it up by each individual substance. So we're asking separate questions for psilocybin mushrooms, MDMA, and then LSD. And this question is, for what reasons should adults be allowed to use the substance? And you can see the different reasons on the y-axis here. So respondents could say all uses should be illegal, or they could choose from things like traditional indigenous practices, to address a mental or physical health condition, for fun or pleasure, for any reason, or I'm not sure. And showing the results here for these three substances, you can see that to address a mental or physical health condition has the highest level of support for all three substances. And psilocybin mushrooms has the highest level of support for any of the reasons for use. And we see higher than MDMA or LSD. And we do see a lot more support for psilocybin as part of a traditional indigenous practice versus MDMA or LSD, which I think is not surprising considering that's more of a nature-based psychedelic versus the synthetic nature of MDMA and LSD. So digging into kind of how respondents' answers to these two questions interact with one another, we wanted to look at whether those who said on the kind of simple, should the legal use of this substance be legal or not, how that matched up with the reasons for use question. So you can see here that among those who, when they were asked, should, and this is just for psilocybin mushrooms, should the use of psilocybin mushrooms be legal or not? If they said yes to this question, the more general question, only 42% of those respondents then went on to say that psilocybin mushrooms should be legal for any reason. So there is some nuance in the opinions related to these different policy options. And then similarly, on the flip side, those who responded that psilocybin mushrooms should not be legal when they were asked the general legalization question about whether legal use should be, whether use of psilocybin mushrooms should be legal or not, only 61% of those who said no, not legal, then went on to say all uses of psilocybin mushrooms should be legal when asked a more detailed question about reasons for use. So finally, we did ask another question about where adults should be able to get different substances. Again, psilocybin mushrooms, MDMA, and LSD. I'm showing results here just for psilocybin mushrooms. And the response options were what you see in the rows here. So from a spiritual or religious group, and let me see exactly what the question was. So the question is framed as, if psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms, were legally available to adults, where should they be able to get them? So this is kind of a hypothetical question about where adults should be able to access them if they were legal. And we weren't surprised to see that there was the highest support for access in a medical facility, and that would be with supervision, closely followed by a prescription, which would actually be taken at home in the formulation of our question, and then at a retreat or wellness center, which would be with supervision. And we saw a really similar pattern of responses for MDMA and LSD for this question, and you can see all of the detailed results there in our report. So those were the three kind of sets of questions that we asked. We asked in general about legal use of these substances. We asked about reasons for use, and then we asked about kind of supply options. And when we look at our findings and compare them to Berkeley's findings, overall, I think that BCSP's findings show higher public support for psychedelics policy changes away from prohibition. But I would also note that the surveys differed in really key ways. So the Berkeley Psychedelics Survey asked about the general category of psychedelics, as I mentioned before, while RAND's survey asked about specific substances. The policy options differed between the survey questionnaires. So for example, our survey questionnaire didn't include things like expanding research or removing criminal penalties. And Berkeley's survey, as I mentioned previously, also sampled registered voters, while our sample was US residents aged 18 and over. So those things can make a big difference. And I'd like to just point out a few differences quickly, where there are some findings that are somewhat comparable, but you can see in them where some of the differences are between the two surveys and our findings. So I'll be showing the RAND psychedelic survey findings in purple on the left, and then I'll be showing the Berkeley psychedelic survey results in yellow on the right. And so starting out with kind of our top line finding for psilocybin mushrooms, 23% of US adults support the legal use of psilocybin mushrooms. Just to compare that to a few results from Berkeley, 28% of US voters strongly supported removing criminal penalties for personal use or possession of psychedelics. So we see a little bit of parity there when we think of something that might be similar to legal use. And then another finding from the Berkeley Psychedelic Survey, 37% of US voters supported regulated access to psychedelics for anyone age 21 and over. And so you can kind of see how the framing of these things might lead to different sorts of responses. And then thinking about some of the therapeutic use findings, looking at this finding from the Berkeley Psychedelics Survey, 46% of US voters strongly supported making the therapeutic use of psychedelics legal. And this can kind of be compared to 30% of US adults from our survey who supported addressing a mental or physical health condition as a reason for the legal use of psilocybin mushrooms by adults. And then another kind of comparable number from our survey, which is actually a little bit higher than Berkeley's finding here, is that when we asked about if psilocybin mushrooms were legal, 49% of US adults supported access to psilocybin mushrooms in a medical facility. So I think that's a nice way to just kind of think about the two different surveys and really keep in mind the sampling frames were quite different, even though these are both nationally representative surveys. And of course, the framing of these two questions was different. And I really appreciated what Andrea said earlier about needing different information sources. And I'm so glad that we're able to kind of collaborate and compare our responses. And with that, I will turn it back over to Andrea. My email is here on the slide if anyone has more specific questions for me. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thanks again for partnering with us on this webinar. Congratulations on your great work. And thank you also for making the similarities and the differences between our surveys so clear. We've been tracking questions and we're going to come off of mute to address them. I'm going to address the first one, then I'll turn to Tyrone, and then he'll address the second and turn to Karanda. If you have other questions to ask, please feel free to chat them. I see something just popped up in the Q&A, so I'll check that when I'm done addressing Cameron Wolf's question. So he asked, what do you account for the increase among 65-year-olds regarding psychedelics proximity? And we would really love to do qualitative research to understand why. And the same with increases related to Black voter responses and conservative responses. With regard to 65-year-olds and up, we have some hunches that psychedelics are being discussed more in society, particularly with regard to aging, end-of-life use, possibly with regard to some diseases, but we really don't know why. And I think this pointed out the whats, but we'd really love to investigate the whys more. So I'm going to turn to Tyrone for the next one.
Hi. Yeah, the second question was about whether our policy propositions they're related to psychedelics as a prescription medicine or therapeutic use were specific to psychedelics themselves as the medicine, or whether it was a combination of psychedelics and therapy, for example. The way that our questions are currently worded, it focuses specifically on psychedelics as the medicine or the treatment without the addition of therapy. But given the direction that the field is going, I think that that's a really important thing for us to think about and maybe incorporate moving forward, to ask more directly about psychedelic-assisted therapies as well. Passing over to Karanda.
Awesome. And I'll take Laura's question about when we think about messengers who might be effective in communicating the safety and value of regulated psychedelics and who or what kind of person comes to mind. And the answer is it depends. Effective messengers are really dependent on who it is that people trust and the contexts that they exist within. And here I like to think about what we can learn from literature on effective science communication. Know your audience, tailor your message, consider your narrative, strengthen relationships, and allow for that trust building and really meeting people where they are and understanding and what they want to learn. And this is especially relevant within psychedelics where different communities have such complex and rich histories related to these substances that shape that perception and shape what they want to learn that range from the indigenous stewardship of plant medicines to the counterculture of the 1960s and the subsequent war on drugs. So our data is indicating how different demographic and political populations are already having these different perspectives about safety and stigma and what would it mean for messaging to be relevant and accessible and timely and credible for these different audiences.
Thanks so much, Karanda. Fielding the questions as they come in. I'm going to turn to Michelle for the question about ketamine.
Yeah, there's a question here, and I think you should be able to see it now in the Q&A. Is contemporary regulated legal use of ketamine in medical and therapeutic settings influencing opinion about the safety or legalization of psychedelics? You know, it's interesting because sometimes the definition of psychedelics is somewhat debated, and ketamine is sometimes included and sometimes not. It's not one of the classic psychedelics, but I do think that it is put into this category in the minds of the public, and it does have a different legal status in the United States, so it is easier to access in a legal way. And I would say that this really points out this interesting tension in psychedelics policy, which is that there is this conversation about psychedelics as a class of substances. What's included or not is debatable, but each of these substances does have its own unique risk profile and reasons for use, and things that it might be more useful for or less effective for in a therapeutic context. So, you know, there's also a lot of high profile media stories about the use of ketamine. And so I would say definitely that those media stories especially are influencing the public perception of psychedelics. And there's a lot to be said for about the need for education about the differences between these substances and their different risk profiles as well.
All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to give some very quick answers to the questions that we have in front of us, and I'll see if anyone wants to add anything real quick after I do so. Both surveys were done before the federal government's recent policy change on psychedelics. I know this is speculation. Do you think the change will have an impact on public opinion? I think yes. And I think it's hard to know which direction, but it seems like it would definitely boost visibility. The number of calls we got from journalists who weren't on the psychedelic beat was interesting after the executive order. Very curious to see if more specifics unfold and what direction that might make people be inclined to change their beliefs. And will the survey talk about individuals having agency to test substances anonymously? We will be changing the survey a bit this year. So if you have thoughts about what we could do, please let us know. I see additional, okay, I see a comment. So we're going to track the comment and I'm going to close this out. If you have additional thoughts for any of us, please feel free to get in touch with us. And if you want to chat, let us know. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Thank you for the excellent questions. If you haven't downloaded the BCSP or RAND reports, the team's putting the links in the chat again for everyone. Again, we'll post the recording of this webinar at psychedelics.berkeley.edu/survey. Join the mailing lists, follow on socials, have a great rest of your week, and thank you so much again for being here today.